Hello, I'm Marsha Bonhart, and welcome to the Dayton Commission Candidates Forum brought to you by the Dayton Weekly News. This is Dayton's longest running African-American news publication. And we've invited all of the candidates to join us on Zoom to respond to a series of questions and issues that are on the minds of Dayton voters. Welcome. And we welcome now Stacy Benson-Taylor, candidate for Dayton City Commissioner. Hello, and thanks for being with us today.
Hello. Thank you. Good morning or afternoon.
All right. You've done union work with budgets and negotiations, but as a commissioner, you're going to be overseeing larger amounts of money that will be dispersed among many different areas. So will that be more challenging for you?
I think it is more challenging, obviously, because it is a larger budget. But before I left my job at AFSCME as the regional director, we actually had 55 contracts in our office. I also represented, in addition to the 750 employees at the city of Dayton, I represented 800 plus employees at Montgomery County. So I have dug deep into budgets throughout this region. And one of the things that has been a priority is making sure that we are paying attention to staffing levels while and balancing the budget, but ensuring that we are providing the services that the citizens need. So, I mean, I think it's going to be a deeper dive just because it is the entire city, but I actually represented employees in nearly every department in the city. So I am familiar with the entire budget.
Will you be able to provide all the services that the city of Dayton will need within the city's budget?
Yes, one thing that I do have the opportunity or the benefit is the creative thinking that it has taken up to this point to provide services. When it comes to looking at a contract or looking at what is needed and figuring out how we make those adjustments, the union has collaborated with the city. I've represented those employees through 2 recessions, the loss of a major airline, the transfer of the convention center to a private entity, and through this pandemic over the last 15 years. And so I've had to think outside of the box and be creative. And I think I can do that with the entire city budget.
Let's talk about, thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Let's talk about how linking organized labor to the community will improve access for specific populations.
It's huge. It is vital that organized labor work with our community. I've worked with the AFL-CIO, the labor organization, to help with a program called Building Futures. It is an apprenticeship program. And what that does is that allows young people to come into a pre-apprenticeship program that gives them construction, math, et cetera, and it prepares them to go into one of the trades. They go on I wouldn't say field trips, but tours of the different union organizations, and then they pick their top 3. It's that type of connection that we need to make between labor and the community so that we can have access to these jobs. Before I became, I worked at the public defender and came to the union eventually, I worked at Delphi. So I understand that we were a community that really believed that manufacturing was our future. Our children, our grandchildren, our, great-grandchildren would be in manufacturing. We have to change the narrative. The trades need us, and we need to make sure we make that connection so that those opportunities are available.
How would you make them, though? I mean, how difficult would that be?
Well, I think the Building Futures program is a perfect example. That program was designed to go into to work with the Dayton public schools. That the idea is that we work with the inner city students to give them access to this program when they come out of high school. The other program that the city has available and worked out is the program with Belmont High School and the EMTs. We direct a lot of kids to college, but we need to start directing a lot of young people towards other opportunities. The trades is a great opportunity. And so, continuing that, in the Building Futures program, I teach implicit bias because I think it's that important that we connect labor with young people who are looking for work. And so recreating those type of programs is exactly what we need to do.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the city declaring racism a public health crisis and getting a lot of criticism because how it's allocating its budget dollars in this area for its lack of investment in the Human Relations Council. Yes. We learned in an article from the Dayton Daily News earlier this year that It's protecting the civil rights of vulnerable community members and providing contracting assistance to minority businesses. And it's also an integral part of the police reform efforts with the HRC I'm speaking of. So what have you done specifically, or rather, I'm sorry, what would you do to support the HRC, the Human Relations Council, as it continues to work to close the gap of racial disparities and to strengthen equity and inclusion regarding contract opportunities within the city of Dayton?
So I was the co-chair on the training task force or work group for the police reform. So this subject matter is really, really important to me. The HRC provides a lot of vital services that our community needs to bridge that gap between, contracting as well as civil rights representation. As the union representative for 700 plus employees, though, I am mindful that the entire city took a budget reduction. Those employees that I represented took a 1.54-hour cut per paycheck to deal with the fact that we were in a financial crisis. I would look at the budget and try and figure out if there was a way to address some of those gaps. And with the HRC, we were specifically looking at vacant positions. Because of vacancies, those services were not provided as effective as maybe we would have liked them to have been. But I sat in layoff meetings with employees in other areas in the city. If we had have made a decision to fund vacant positions, it is likely that we would have laid off employees in other areas. I, as a union representative who believes in that workers' rights are a civil right, those employees would have been minorities and women. And so when we look at this, we have to look at it holistically. How are we effectively providing this service? We used to have 1,500 bargaining unit employees that provided the city services for AFSCME. We are down to 700. And so when I look at the budget, I look at it across every area to say we are required statutorily to provide certain services to the city of Dayton. Should we step on workers' rights, which is a civil rights, to ensure that we are covering civil rights? I would not just make a decision like that. I believe we have to look at it holistically. And before I would fill a vacant position to lay someone off or negatively impact them, as I stated, I sat in meetings with people who took a substantial pay cut as a result of these challenges and obstacles. And so I would not agree to fill vacant positions. I would look at that staffing. I would look at how we could be effective with the people that we had until we were able to come out of this budget situation. And with us receiving money that helps to recover some of the lost revenue, which is exactly what the Recovery Act does. The CARES Act did not provide that revenue replacement. The CARES Act does. It now puts us in a position to assess the HRC and to, number one, see if we were being the most effective and efficient. And then number two, figure out how we fully fund them according to the needs that we have for our staff.
Perhaps I'm confused, or perhaps I wasn't clear. I just wanted to speak more specifically about the Human Relations Council, closing the gap of racial disparities and strengthening equity and inclusion. And I hear what you're saying, and those efforts are great, but can you be more specific about the HRC and its role and what you would do with a bit more strength to support the HRC?
Well, one of the things that I would do is, again, look at what our staffing model is. I think we have a lot of staff there, but are we effectively providing the services? So the first thing to do when we're looking at that funding is making sure that we are providing the staffing that meets the needs. One of the things that came out of our work groups is that we should not have the people making complaints reporting to the police department. I think that strengthens the role of the HRC. When we look at who is sitting on these boards, who is providing or receiving the complaints, that's one thing that we needed to look at. Are we being most effective and efficient? When it comes to providing access to contracts, access to what small businesses need, those would certainly be areas where we need to make sure that we are staffed appropriately. within the budget constraints so that we can continue to provide those services. One of the things for me in economic development in the community is making sure that we are providing the services that small businesses need, minority businesses need. That's what's going to strengthen our communities. That's how we build our communities from the inside out. So those services and help with contracting and help with access to information, grants, and all of those things that strengthen small minority businesses, we absolutely need those services.
Thank you. Let's respond to national events now regarding community police relations. The city underwent a 9-month police reform process with members of the community included. Do you think that this really addresses the issues of race relations and policing?
I think it's a start. As the co-chair of the training committee, one of the things that I emphasized was that until people who look like me are stopped the same as people who look like the officers that are doing the stopping, then we have a problem. And so what is it that we need to do to help those officers who seem to police our neighborhoods differently? What is it we need to do to, I used to say to the officers, help us help you. Tell us what it is that you need. If it is training, if it is conversations, whatever we need to do. I think the police reform process opens up the door. It allows for the tough conversations that were needed. And it wasn't easy. Even in a group of training, we had to have some tough conversations. You have to start the process with tough conversations. If you go in and you decide we're going to turn the apple cart over and you do not deal with the culture, you have the same problem and becomes a festering problem. And so I believe what the police reform groups did was it took and shined a flashlight on what the issues are. Helped the police see that how they see policing is not always accurate. And the example that I used in my training group was for the George Floyd protest. SWAT policed our community different than they policed an entire concert when Dave Chappelle was here. And I continue to bring those officers back to that because SWAT was involved in both cases, but the way SWAT moved and the way SWAT approached the crowds was it was completely different. And so we have to get to the bottom of that. What makes me be policed differently? That's where these conversations need to go. And in the training work group, we worked on making sure that our curriculum included more implicit bias training, not just for new recruits, but also for current officers and for command staff, because there has to be a buy-in from command staff that this is the direction that we're going. We worked on making sure that we included a cultural competency component to the training. So that added an additional week of training to the academy so that we could start to deal with some of these race relation issues, some of which are implicit bias, some of these things, but there are some races that absolutely have to be weeded out of our police department.
You know, I'm just curious, what was the response when you pointed out the differences in the coverage, the SWAT coverage of one situation versus the Dave Chappelle's concert? How was that responded to you?
I think it's a little it was difficult to hear because what I tend to see when I have these conversations, good police officers have trouble seeing what we see, even when they see it, because they don't want to believe that it exists in their ranks, I guess. And so I think it was a little hard to hear. That is what we felt, but I felt like it was important to make sure we reiterated that this was not based upon simply what happened to George Floyd. The reason why we were all at the table is because of what happened in Dayton, Ohio. And so we got past that. But initially, the response was, well, I don't think that, they're the context. We often went back to, well, maybe we didn't understand the context of the situations. And my pushback on that was, well, the context can also be that some officers police African Americans or brown people differently. And so we need to be mindful of that context. But we went back to that context of the stop, context of the situation several times, but I would not allow us to stay there and leave it in that gray area of what we don't know, because what we do know is that we are being stopped or stopped differently. The last time that I was stopped for my blinker being out, and this was 18 months ago, not for not using my turn signal, and the officers had their hands on their weapons. That's not happening to people who don't look like me. And so we have to have those conversations.
Would you consider that under the definition of implicit bias, or is that flat out racist?
It's hard to say for the simple fact that not having talked to those two officers, I can't gauge where they're coming from, but I would say that as an African American on the west side of Dayton in a car that they may have thought was somebody else because of the rims or whatever, they made a conscious decision to stop me and for not using a turn signal, which is could be their bias and their perception that that was probably an African American and they may be able to find something, or it could be race. It could be flat out racism. Both of those are options, but the only reason I don't say is because I didn't have a chance other than that stop to talk to those officers.
Thank you. Let's talk about the downtown Dayton core. Certainly a rebirth in development. You have the arcade that's open, you have upscale housing, commercial development, a lot of that subsidized by city money. So some citizens are concerned that this same kind of investment has not been spread throughout the neighboring communities. So what will you commit to make sure that Dayton's neighboring communities experience the same type of rebirth as downtown?
So one of the things that I did, because this concerned me years ago, was I agreed to sit on the West Dayton Development Steering Committee. And I asked those questions. Why don't we have a grocery store? What about development? And so I learned a lot of things. I learned that grocery stores had been courted and they did not want to come. I learned that Brown Street was 17 years in the making from the first conversation to the groundbreaking. That type of education is important. If we want to build in our communities, we need to make sure we know exactly what that means. What you said, the city invests money. We need to understand and make sure that our community understands that the city leverages funds for other people to come in. And so we have to make sure that we are having the right conversation with the right type of businesses that want to come into communities that are growing. I believe that we build our communities from the inside out. I believe that we invest in our small businesses. The entrepreneurs market to me is an ideal situation. What we've done, or what Tay Winston has done, is she has brought together a group of entrepreneurs and basically created a larger scale business. And so what that does is that helps outside developers see that we actually have money to spend. When a grocery store or a corporation comes into the city, they put a dot down and then they draw a circle and they say, how much money is being spent in this radius? Well, because we don't have the same type of opportunities to shop and spend in our communities, then it gives the impression that we don't have the funds. So building from the inside out, such as the entrepreneurs market, such as the Gem City market, starts to allow us to spend our dollars in our community, which then can help investors see, oh, they do spend. They were not spending in their community because they didn't have these options. Now that they have these options, they're keeping their money in their community. The other thing that this does when we build our communities from the inside out, it allows us to determine the terms and conditions of who comes to comes to our communities and what that looks like. Right now, we are looking for people to come into our communities to build, but what happens is they come into our communities and then they leave. Well, if we own it, we're not leaving our community. And if we don't own it and somebody wants to come because we are thriving, then we determine those terms and what that looks like. And so I think we need to build from the inside out. It's going to take that investment from the city. So it's a dual problem. It's a dual solution, investing in those small businesses, but also, again, looking at who the type of businesses that we want to come and invest in our community as well. That growth can be duplicated. That growth absolutely can be duplicated, but we have to find the right model that works for each community. And that may be different when you look at a Wright Dunbar versus another community. And so we have to be creative. We have to have conversations with, our young people want to live in an urban center. They want to live, work, and shop. Downtown allows them to do that. So now we grow that model from downtown, and we help spread that through investment.
Thank you. Governor Mike DeWine has announced an initiative to address minority health and racial disparities. Mayor Whaley and the city commissioners have praised his declaration that racism is indeed a public health crisis, and they've declared racism as a public health emergency. So what are your thoughts on that declaration, and what will you do to address the issue of racial disparity in this area?
So I'm excited that they're at the party and that they now realize exactly what we have been living, whether it is healthcare, whether it is education, whether it is employment, whether it is housing, food desert. We already know that racism is a public health crisis. We have lived that. And so I'm excited that they now see that and are acknowledge that, because I don't believe it wasn't seen. I believe that it was easy to not acknowledge that this was an issue. So COVID exposed a lot of fractures and turned them into craters because people could not address them. And it was very difficult to ignore. For me, improving the economic situation for our citizens is a game changer. We can't do what we need to do and position ourselves if we can't afford good health care. If we are not in the game when it comes to jobs, then we cannot afford quality housing. We cannot afford all of the necessities that we need. And a lot of times it is racism and our exclusion from these systems that puts us in this position. And so we have to be deliberate in making sure that we improve the economic situation of African Americans in our community, and not just African Americans, because if we go across the bridge to the east side of Dayton, there are disadvantaged people who are experiencing the exact same thing as we are. So this is a race issue, but this is also a poverty or disadvantaged population issue where healthcare, education, etc. So once we start to look at how we connect people with the jobs, how we allow people to get into these apprenticeship programs or connect the dots for these programs, because I believe there's a lot of stuff out there, but the access to information is part of that public health crisis. There's a lot of programs, there's a lot of things available that we don't necessarily have access to because we don't have the information. And so making sure that the citizens have the information about what's out there could be a game changer for a lot of people. But if we don't know where to go, or we don't know who holds the key, or we don't know who to talk to, then we're out of the game before the game even gets started. And so we have to, for me, improving communication, and also improving our economic and financial situations allows us to be in a better situation to challenge these systems that exist.
So this next question will be your last. Thank you so much for that response. And your response really segues well into the next question, which is Dayton is set to receive that $147 million funding from the latest COVID-19 stimulus bill. So your plan to invest those dollars would be?
Well, I do understand that of the $147 million, some of that money is for revenue recovery, to take care of funds that were lost because of lost jobs in the community. It takes between 85 and 125 City of Dayton employees, not City of Dayton, it takes between 85 and 125 employees paying taxes in the City of Dayton to pay for one City of Dayton job. So that lost revenue drastically impacts the general fund. So looking at that revenue and being mindful that this is a one-time $147 million. So we cannot invest that in things that would compound like salaries. It has to be invested in ways that we can use it that one time and not expect to have an expense as a result. There has to be some investment in the communities. And I do believe that when the federal regulations come down, and I want to say after the CARES Act, it was about 30 days before the actual the required guidelines that the feds will issue regarding how a city can use the money will come down. So those have not come down to the best of my knowledge yet, but the feds will say how that money specifically can be used, and they will give guidelines. Within those guidelines, I do believe that investing in the communities is one of those things. We have to spend that money investing in the communities. Every community is not the same. I have been to neighborhood association meetings. Some cities or some neighborhoods want that money invested in what they call their assets, their parks. Other communities want that money invested in the abandoned properties, clearing out some of those houses. And so I don't believe that there is a one size fits all model. I believe that when we look at investing and what that number is and how that money is allocated by the federal government, whatever that money is that can be invested in the neighborhoods, then we need to make sure that we are in touch with the neighborhoods. Staffing levels, that money and that revenue replacement absolutely should go there. What we hear from our community is that we need better streets. We need the trash needs to be picked up. We need a lot of things. Well, revenue replacement allows for vacancies to be filled. So we during the COVID pandemic, there were about 100 people who left and retired from the city. There were 100 vacant positions that were over 100 vacant positions that were abolished. So we have to, in order to provide those vital services that the citizens expect, we're also going to have to make sure that we are filling those gaps for that staffing level so that we can provide those services. So for me, two very important things: staffing levels to ensure those vital services are provided, and investing in the community for what each community needs. Very important.
Ms. Stacy Benson-Taylor, thanks so very much for your time. We appreciate you.
Thank you.